Okay, this will be the summary for week 4. This week we finish up with the topics pertaining to the first assignment, and then we get into topics related to developing your solution. As always, we start off with an interactive lecture based on the readings. So let's have a look through the questions we had for the week. The first question relates to various research methods where the researcher is separate from the subjects of the study. The obvious benefit of avoiding interaction is that we can avoid bias on the part of the research subjects. For example, we can avoid social desirability bias, which is people's propensity to give what they believe is the socially acceptable answer when faced with certain questions. But biases can also be introduced by the researcher. When you ask someone a question, you are in effect asking them to produce a certain type of data in the response. This opens up the possibility of a whole range of other biases. Question 2. Ethnographic studies. These are studies where the researcher immerses themselves with the topic, either by working with or living with the population of interest. This wouldn't be the obvious choice for well-understood topics, where ongoing research might be targeting very specific questions. And even if we have some doubts about existing theory, a more common way of testing a causal link in a theory would be through experimentation. Question 3. The article refers to an example of content analysis where certain words and phrases are coded as indicating dishonesty. To support their argument, we could say that through data analysis we can find a correlation whereby certain words and phrases have a greater than chance association with dishonesty. As a counter-argument, you might point out that the correlation would be very weak, that certain people use different phrases in their regular speech, that at a job interview, as in the example, people may be nervous, and that interpreting the context of the phrases is much more important than simply counting the occurrence of the phrases, if we are to make any judgment about honesty. Question 4. If we are researching a poorly understood topic, that means we are trying to discover new themes and patterns. This means we should use open questions rather than a set of fixed questions, leading us to use semi-structured or even unstructured interviews. Question 5. Surveys are a very inexpensive source of data, especially web surveys which can be put up in minutes. They also provide consistency if we want to ask everyone the exact same question. As for limitations, a survey wouldn't capture rich qualitative data. Even with open questions, you can't hope for more than a sentence or two as a response. While on the quantitative end, you're mostly limited to summary statistics. That is, summarizing the different responses as percentages, etc. Obviously, you can't get into any causal inference from a survey, but even correlation can have problems. One type of business research that has been criticized is using surveys to discern patterns within organizations. For example, a survey may ask how prevalent a certain practice is in the organization and how beneficial it is for the organization, which might be presented as a correlation. Quite concerning, because it's like asking a manager, do the things that you do contribute to the organization's success? But just split up across 2 survey questions, which is rather flawed. You now have self-correlating data. And there are also concerns about return rates. If only 20% of your sample returned the survey, what point of view is not included in the data? That opens up some new challenges. Question 6. The ethical dilemma in the example is essentially seeking out favourable data to reach the conclusion we would like. In other words, a lack of neutrality. Now, neutrality is a concern with any type of research, even research which is methodologically objective. For example, a quantitative measure would be objective, that is to say, we have no doubts about the specific number that was captured. However, there is still the choice of what to measure, and this choice of metric can be affected by a lack of neutrality. And just like the example in the reading, the metric might be chosen to support a given agenda. So yes, this is a problem which extends far beyond interpersonal methods such as focus groups. Question 7. A product-oriented layout is the sequential step-by-step production of a product, such as you would see with an assembly line. The main advantage is consistency, because everything happens in a linear sequence. So a given step of the process will always be carried out by the same people, who are hyper-specialized in that activity. This also means that if you need to make some adjustments to the product, you can easily isolate the relevant step in the process. However, it is difficult to make larger changes because the product-oriented layout is less flexible. And you need to be very careful about throughput. That is to say, every step should take a comparable amount of time if you are to avoid a bottleneck. Economically, there's pros and cons. The argument for greater specialization is to bring down unit costs, as your employees become really proficient at doing the same thing over and over. However, this can lead to injuries, boredom, apathy, and employee attrition, and therefore additional costs in replacing and retraining employees, which makes it difficult to agree on the exact economics of the situation. After all, what is the economic value of job satisfaction? We know it's important, we can see the connection to more financial metrics, but job satisfaction itself is intangible. Perhaps it's best to illustrate with a counterexample. There was an interesting initiative at Canon, which was carried out by Hitoshi Yamada, and I believe this was in relation to their photocopiers, which are rather complex machines with hundreds and hundreds of parts. Usually these would come off an assembly line, with each employee specializing in adding several parts. But what they did at Canon was the opposite. They trained employees to assemble the whole machine. So of course this took longer, and the efficiency for individual components might have been a bit lower, but now the employee could take responsibility for the whole finished product, and also take pride in their work, which they emphasize by having the employee sign next to the serial number. I think that's an interesting example of a more people-centric approach. It also affords greater flexibility, because you can scale the assembly team up and down by one person at a time, which you may need to do when the demand for different products of your company changes. In contrast, scaling up an assembly line means doubling production, so you can't fine-tune the rate of output as much. Anyway, it would be interesting to see someone attempt an economic analysis of such radically different approaches. But again, how would you quantify employee loyalty in such an analysis? Question 8. A very efficient sales process will be highly standardized, whereas a customized sales process will be less efficient, which is an important business decision. Are you going for the mass market, or are you targeting individual people or businesses? In the latter case, your sales team will need to investigate and understand the specific needs of one customer, which is naturally time-consuming. Question 9. The House of Quality tool connects individual product attributes to the process steps which affect those attributes. And also we would include data about how important each attribute is to customers, based on focus groups or similar. This allows us to do a few things. What is especially useful is prioritizing attention within the company. That is to say, if we are going to invest time and resources in improvement, we want to make sure that we improve those areas which really have an impact on what the customers value in our product. Question 10. The short answer here is, it depends. In the affirmative, yes. We are often interested in time-related improvements, be that throughput, end-to-end cycle time, waiting time, etc. In any of those situations, it helps us to understand where delays are occurring, because any one of those could be a target for intervention. In fact, we would often go as far as measuring the individual delays and recording them on the model. Now, the negative response is quite simple. If our improvement goal is not time-related, there is no value in recording the delays in the model, because they don't represent actual activities. Including them would provide unnecessary detail in the model and clutter up our diagram. So instead we should focus on capturing more detail about the actual activities. And finally, question 11. Business process reengineering was a very popular method, but it grew into a trendy fad and subsequently fizzled out. So why did that happen? If we look at most methods which became business fads, we should ask what is the time and place for that method. With BPR, that takes us a while back. It takes us back to Michael Hammer's original article, and some of the examples of the problem this method was meant to solve. These typically relate to early deployments of IT, when companies were moving away from manual paper-based processes to digitized processes. And if we look at those, we find some amusing anecdotes, such as approval processes where different people need to sign a document. Where only partial changes were made, you ended up with strange situations, such as documents being printed out, physically signed, and then scanned back into the computer. So the appeal of business process reengineering was to avoid these silly things. By redesigning the process from scratch, it can be more efficient, the argument goes. And in some of those cases, it's a reasonable argument. The flip side is, you are throwing away something which already works in your company. As inefficient as your existing process might be, it currently gets the job done. So scrapping it and replacing it with something new is a business risk. And the more important the process, the greater the risk. Also, you're typically dealing with a large project, so you have the additional risks of a large project, such as going over budget, over time, etc. Putting all that together, we end up with a lot of results that are less than impressive, and apply to situations where more surgical intervention would be appropriate, rather than what is essentially a wrecking ball. Now, like with other tools, there is a time and place for everything. And process reengineering still might have a place in situations where we introduce technologies that affect several distinct parts of the process, and we see potential inefficiency, such as the approval process anecdote. So, as we've seen in one of the readings, there are many different approaches to research. The first distinction that is often made is between qualitative and quantitative approaches. That is, methods based on the interpretation of words versus methods that focus on numbers. To make this more of a hands-on topic, we've picked one qualitative and one quantitative paper. And in the class we get half of the students to look at each of them. After a few minutes we have a group discussion. And students see that the qualitative paper relies on thematic analysis, from which the researchers identify some relevant patterns. Now, in the quantitative paper, students point out that the researchers focus a lot on precision, and that the study itself is a test of some ideas for intervention, in this case, for smoking. The 2x2 design of the experiment is also interesting, though it does take more careful reading of the article to understand that. The experiment tests two types of intervention, nicotine gum and counselling, which are tested individually and for interactions. Overall, the two articles provide exemplars for the two ends of the qualitative-quantitative spectrum. Then we have a further discussion about academic articles. For the first point, we discuss the value of both theoretical and empirical papers. The value of empirical studies is quite straightforward. We have an idea and we gather evidence to test the idea. Or perhaps we don't understand a topic and have a more open-ended investigation. Either way, these articles present some real-world data, which their analysis and discussion is based on. But theoretical articles can be useful too. Take, for example, Nickerson 1998. An excellent article about confirmation bias. It's a comprehensive article about various research that has been done on the topic, but the article itself doesn't present any new data, so it is not an empirical study by any stretch. So what makes an article like that useful? It brings together the findings of various empirical studies in one place, providing a great resource if we want to see what the current understanding of a topic is, without being overwhelmed by the details that we typically see in an empirical paper. So we need both types of articles. In the next point, we discuss two types of reasoning that we can see in research. With inductive reasoning being the process where we interpret data to come up with a theoretical model, and deductive reasoning in the opposite direction, taking a theoretical model and then seeking out data to test it. Again, both of these are complementary. We can also see how inductive reasoning is more associated with qualitative research, and likewise deduction with quantitative research. However, there are exceptions. Some quantitative methods such as clustering can be used to find new patterns in an inductive fashion. And some qualitative research will start with an a priori model, giving it a deductive component. The next point I added because I think many students wonder if academic writing is complex just for the sake of sounding impressive. So it is important to make the distinction between topics which simply are complex and therefore take time to learn the language and jargon used around them, as opposed to writing which relies heavily on sophistry and obscurantism. For discussion in the class, we look up the Sokal affair, which happened some years ago when Sokal, a physics researcher, published a fake article claiming that gravity was a social construct. What was interesting about the case was that this actually got accepted into a peer-reviewed journal, which raises all kinds of questions. And there have been many other cases of fake articles being submitted to journals as tests. For example, this has shown that certain journals that claim to have peer review actually don't. Which brings us to the final point and the focus of class discussion. How, given an article, can we judge its quality? To which students propose many sensible ideas, such as looking up the authors and ascertaining their experience within a given area. Or perhaps looking up some citations and finding what others in the field think about the article. There's quite a few things we can do to improve our confidence that we are reading a good article. However, each of them is time-consuming and has its limitations, so we need to proceed with caution. Another question for researchers to ask themselves is how specific they should be with the research topic. One argument here that I've found to be quite inspiring comes from social psychology, specifically from William Maguire. Now, this might be an odd choice for the book of the day, given the audience of engineering and IT students, but I thought this would be a good reason to include it because you are less likely to come across it. Maguire argued against the pursuit of simplistic research topics. Yes, they allow for more precise research, but the findings might not be very useful. The example he provides is in relation to TV violence and people's aggression, a topic with a lot of research. However, Maguire points out that much of the research is done from a very simple perspective. One of 4 perspectives, actually. And he collates these 4 perspectives in a 2x2 matrix, as seen on the slide. So first we have the perspective that watching violence on TV makes people more aggressive, which is the view of the researchers in the top left quadrant. Then we have the perspective that watching violence on TV makes people less aggressive, by providing some sort of release. These are the views of the researchers in the bottom left quadrant. Next we have the view that the causality is the other way around, and that it is people's aggressiveness which will draw them to watching violence on TV, which is the view of the researchers in the top right quadrant. And finally the perspective that less aggressive people seek out violence on TV, as a kind of novelty. And this is the view of the researchers in the bottom right quadrant. So what does this mean? This seems to be quite the contradiction. Maguire argues that this is actually the starting point for research, because there is some truth in each of those perspectives, and the researcher should seek out to understand under what circumstances each of those might be true, which of course is more difficult than examining just one of these perspectives. Now this allows for an interesting exercise. Take each of the quadrants one by one, and design a study or even just some questions which would yield data to confirm that perspective. I would encourage you to do that as an exercise. It really comes back to that question of neutrality, and shows how easy it is to fixate on one perspective and find confirming information. As far as your assignments go, that is more work. Taking different perspectives and contrasting them is more of a challenge, but it will take you to a better understanding of the topic. And for most assignments, that thoughtfulness is preferable. Next we take a look at the second assignment. For most students, the problem is carried over from the first assignment. However, it is possible to change, though if you do change you will need to research the topic again, especially the evidence for the problem. This is once again to ensure you are tackling a real problem. But once you establish that, it's time to look at the solution, starting with exploring what existing solutions there are for that problem. And you can be sure there are plenty out there. Any non-trivial problem has people looking at it. So your first step is to find out what people are doing. By doing this, you may discover that your idea has already been done. So you will need to pursue a new idea. Or you may find limitations in what people have done, and you will propose a refinement to what they've done. For task 5, it is important to explain how your solution works. This relates to the concept of black boxing, whereby we exclude the details of a particular part of the solution from discussion. It's the part of the design where, quote-unquote, all the magic happens. Well, that's not good enough. We don't accept magic solutions. You have to explain how it works. So for a technical solution that relies on, say, blockchain, you may need to provide a diagram of all the cryptographic keys in your solution, and so on and so forth. Moving on, change concepts we will discuss later today, and the other topics we will discuss in the coming weeks. So again, you will need to investigate what's already being done about the problem you're focusing on. This includes ideas, current projects, or past projects. It can be quite useful to look at past projects to understand what worked and what didn't work, which gives you a better idea of what solutions you can come up with for the problem. Like most things, innovation has many definitions. I think this is a good way of looking at it. The top part, what is desirable, relates to what we've already talked about, the problem. If you want customers to be interested in what you're selling, you need to be solving a problem for them. That's what makes your solution desirable. But of course you need to consider what's possible with current technology. Even if something is desirable as a pure novelty, say the flying bicycles, that doesn't matter if we can't physically build them. And finally the market, which is another reason to research existing solutions. Entering an established market with essentially the same product as everyone else is usually a bad idea. So which companies are innovative? Some argue that this is a quantitative question, and that we should just look at research and development spending as an indicator, which is all well and good until you look at the accounting. Do we label this investment as infrastructure or research and development? Sometimes the choice can go either way, so it's not clear what the final numbers represent. At this point we have another activity. We go around the room and each group identifies a company and answers these questions. This makes for some good discussion, especially for the third question where we discover that some companies aren't necessarily benefiting from the supposed innovation. There are many things out there which are quite clever but don't necessarily contribute to sales, which is an important distinction between creativity and innovation. In the next 3 slides, we look at a recent study of different approaches to innovation in companies. Now, what these researchers found was that the most common approach, just over half of the time, is the traditional process of generating ideas internally and then developing them for the market, as seen on this slide. But there are some alternatives, such as co-development of ideas with customers. And there are also cases where there is a good idea, but a technological constraint that delays it. Next, we discuss different approaches to change. And to start off, we call out the knee-jerk reaction that often happens when we see a problem. We look for simple ways of throwing more resources at the problem. With the Sydney Trains example, it is by far the simplest solution. Add more trains to the network. That's quite simple, but very expensive. On top of which, we might experience diminishing returns. Yes, we can add more trains, but do we have space for them? Or would they start to introduce delays at busy stations? So adding more of the same is usually a weak intervention or the intervention of last resort. Instead, as we previously discussed, we can get better results from a fundamental change to the system. For transportation, that could mean addressing rush hours directly, or even challenging the need to travel in the first place. Now, these are more challenging, but more economical than simply adding more trains. So we have a few different approaches available. First, we can examine the process and the system to find leverage points for a surgical intervention, which we've already covered. 2, creative thinking is self-explanatory. So number 3, adapting known ideas. This is the approach of taking something which works in one context and applying that to a different context. For example, we might find that the trains in Japan operate really well, so we will look there for ideas of how to improve Sydney trains. This saves us from relying on an untested idea, because we are looking at things that already work. But we still need to be careful. Sometimes the difference in context will limit what we can transfer. So if we take, for example, recycling, we can find cities in Japan where recyclables are sorted into 12 or more categories. Now that's very impressive, but could we replicate that here in Australia? We'd probably face some issues. The first would be cultural. The attention to detail as far as recycling goes is very low here. You can find things like old shoes thrown into recycling bins, so it's hard to imagine how people would sort into a greater number of categories. And then there's physical constraints. More granular sorting makes sense in Japan, in part because of the greater population density. It would be a lot less economical in Australia to pick up different categories of recyclables separately. In other words, ideas aren't necessarily transferable between contexts, so we need to be careful. So then we get to number 4, change patterns or change concepts. These complement the repeating patterns we see in problems, which sometimes comes across in the language, such as a bottleneck. Well, you can have a bottleneck on the road, or you can have a bottleneck in an artery. Both represent the same pattern of limited throughput, and both share the pattern of solutions. We can have a bypass on the road, or we can have heart bypass surgery. In both cases alleviating the throughput problem. And that's just one pattern. There are many. Actually, in the improvement guide we can find 72 different patterns, which is a very comprehensive resource that the authors have provided there. In the appendix there is a write-up of each concept with examples. So if you're struggling to come up with an idea for a solution, that's a great resource. The next thing we do in class is discuss some of the students' ideas for their projects. And finally we consider situations where you have multiple ideas. How do you choose which one to go with? There are many different ways you can choose. But first you want to look at how well the idea actually addresses the problem you're trying to solve. After which you consider the practicality of it and how competitive it would be with the market. In the remaining time we examine the first assignment, as it is almost due. The readings for next week cover business models and creativity. And as usual we have a selection of questions.